Patrycja Humienik, daughter of Polish immigrants, is a writer, editor, and performance artist. She has developed writing and movement workshops for the Henry Art Gallery, Arts plus Literature Laboratory, Northwest Film Forum, in prisons, and elsewhere. An MFA candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, she serves as events director for the Seventh Wave, where she is also an editor for the Community Anthologies Project. She is the author of We Contain Landscapes, forthcoming with Tin House and available for pre-order now. Tell me more about your grad school experience and how you ended up pursuing poetry.
Yeah, I'm so happy to get to chat with you. And my grad school experience, which I'm still in right now, I feel really lucky to get to have it, being a little bit older and having worked uh, different day jobs and coming back to school has given me like such an appreciation for it. And it's been interesting, like going back to school and also having a book coming out during and trying to write toward a second book. Um, yeah, I feel like it's been rich to get to be in this space of deep study and have as much of my life as possible be centered around poetry, and getting to teach writing is something I love, and doing some of the editing work I do on the side is amazing. And I had dreamt toward this like kind of focus of being able to center my life around writing. So I'm really grateful. And also there are challenges to making that one's every day and feeling like there's always a deepening that could be done, and the author mode and sort of this mode even of getting to be in dialogue about the book is sort of a different headspace for me than making and studying, if that makes sense.
So you mentioned that you're in a grad program right now. What's it like to release a book while you're like actively pursuing a degree?
Yeah, it's special because I'm here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and grateful to be in a fully funded program where I do have the teaching obligation, but I have the support to be a writer here, and I'm back in the region of my childhood in the Midwest, and there's so many things about it that feel really right for this to be the space I get to release the book in, to have that support that I didn't have while I was writing the book, of like institutional support, even like brilliant people to be able to ask for advice about. I mean, I feel lucky that there have always been writers along this book process in my life, even outside of institutions, but it does feel really special to be held by some of that support right now, and working on a thesis, working toward other writing at the same time, being a teacher, all of the realities of grad school and the things about institutions that are challenging, are definitely create particular variables to like that feel different from the headspace I want to be in as like a debut author, and to split my attention in so many ways is just, I think, the writing life for so many of us. But it's of course not the fantasy like one fantasizes about, being able to like focus in one direction. But maybe it's good. Maybe it's good to be actively pushed to write other work alongside, and to be in this rich space of like surrounded by other people and their brilliant thinking and their projects. I feel really lucky that maybe that keeps me from having this like myopic focus on just the book, because so much else is going on. But I do think sometimes it is more challenging than I expected.
Have you done a lot of events, just like promoting the book?
Not yet. The book is going to be out in March, like 5-ish weeks from now, and I'll do more events when it's actually out. I have read in Madison, and I'm going to be doing more in the upon the book's release.
Awesome. Okay, let's talk about the book. This collection feels so well organized and put together. Every poem contributes to like the overall themes. I'm curious to know more about its development and when in the writing those themes became apparent.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing about, you just asked about the grad program. And every writer is so different, and in these programs, there's a different kind of articulating that you do about the work when you're in workshops, when you're talking about a thesis, the questions that you're asked of it. I think that that's rich and has its value, and for different writers to different degrees. For me, for this first book, I'm so glad I wasn't making it in that space, though, of having to talk about what it is before I knew what it is. I think for me, writing I learn about what I'm writing into by writing into it. And I didn't write We Contain Landscapes being like, this is a book about X and I'm gonna have these images that anchor the book. Like I can't write. I admire that different writers work, and such we all have such different minds, and I'm be so curious like to hear from you about your process. And I think there's no one right way, but for me, like poetry is such a the gifts of poetry are that I can come to it with so many messy questions that I don't know. I was writing this book for years, not knowing exactly what it was, but also knowing that there are central obsessions and questions I have, and these words that are so charged for me, like questions of like devotion or desire or belonging, or all these so many shared questions that children of immigrants have around like the idea of home. So I knew I could like maybe say more vaguely what I was writing into, but writing the book was such a process of uncovering for me, and some of the cohesion that maybe you glean, I do in the revising, I did a lot of work for a long time. Revision is so magical to me, but some of the things that repeat and the maybe cohesion that readers feel is like part of my own obsessive mind around these questions and images that I just couldn't help but return to over and over again. And so it wasn't even like, when people talk to me about this book, they often mention like rivers and water, and I'm like, yes, absolutely. And that wasn't like a choice in a way. It just surfaces when I'm writing because water is so important to me. And so I think I feel grateful to the parts of writing process that are hard to articulate, that feel more subconscious or embodied. And it's interesting being in a program where I'm watching other writers do so beautifully at articulating what their work is doing. And I'm just sort of like, wow, I just learned by like reading back and being in the revising part.
That's awesome. You just mentioned so many parts of like other questions that I had, so I'm excited to delve into this. But in the process of researching you, I came across a different title, Anchor Baby, I think. And I wondered if that was the original title of the collection and how you arrived at the current title.
Yeah, it's a funny little loop because Anchor Baby was the title that this book, um, when it sold to Tin House, when Tin House picked up the book, it was under Anchor Baby. And there's the previous title poem, there's still a poem called Anchor Baby toward the end of the book that had been the seed I thought was the seed of the book as I was more deeply writing it, but looking back, the seed was earlier, and it was in a little project that had been called We Contain Landscapes that I thought was separate. It was this chapbook, and even before that, funnily enough, it was this tiny micro chap that Ross White at Bull City did a tiny, tiny limited run of very like abstracted language, this tiny little seed thing that was called We Contain Landscapes from years ago. And when I was writing what Anchor Baby, what I thought was a different project, I actually realized in the writing that so many of those older poems that they were all part of the same world, and that the title Anchor Baby was sort of like I was in dialogue with people at Tin House about how maybe that wasn't the right title for the book, actually. I was still revising the book after the book deal and noticing how We Contain Landscapes, the old title that I had been a little bit scared to claim, was actually the right thing. And so it gave me more permission in the revising process to really own what the book was.
So, both in the title and throughout the book, you use the word we a lot, and I wondered if you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, that's exactly part of the fear, right, that I had around being like, wow, how could I claim a title that claims the we, which I find the we to be so generative and troubling. And I think I leaned into that. I was like, I'm okay with my book failing in certain ways, of like grasping towards something, reaching toward this idea of a collective that is maybe impossible. Um, at the same time, this idea that human beings contain places in ourselves that are uncharted, that we are in some way related to the land wherever we live, that this question of who the we is when we speak of a we is like really interesting to me. And um, there's so much that feels relational in this book and the reaching toward other immigrant daughters, other beloveds in my life. And it just felt right to keep unpacking the we as part of this project, and even in the ways that I'm really curious about over time how I'll look back at this project. And I think I came to a place where I was like, you know what? A first book, like I'm allowed to be wrong. I'm allowed to be debating myself over the life of like as an artist. I hope I can like keep growing in ways that I'm like interested in having this conversation with other writers about what is the we. And so that is like part of the project too. Even like thinking back about when some of the questions in this book are like reaching back toward people in my lineage that I can never get answers from, that are dead now, or like that I never even had photographs of or whatever, and thinking about that we as well, the impossibility of the we of like our own bloodline, is really interesting to me. So yeah, that pronoun is like a never ending obsession of mine that also feels troubling to try to claim, but I'm really curious about how it lands for readers, and I'm okay with that discomfort, I think.
You mentioned questions a lot, just like in your responses, but also in the book, you mentioned them a lot. And I wondered if you could speak a bit to your relationship to questions and how it impacts your writing.
Yeah, I think writing poetry for me involves a lot of question asking. And I try not to, I think sometimes writers, I catch it in myself. I always put pressure on questions in a poem. Like sometimes you have to ask yourself, like, am I using this as like I don't ever want it to feel like a move, I want it to be a genuine question. And so there are times where maybe my default is to like ask a lot of questions, and then I have to go and put pressure on them and be like, is this a question, or is this actually a statement that I'm scared to claim in some way? And so in revising, I thought about that a lot. And there were many questions that remained, because I was like, oh, these are actual questions that the speaker has, that I have, that this like book is asking, that I want to invite a reader into asking. And I feel like asking good questions, learning to ask questions in our lives is like a beautiful relational skill, and also for our relationship with ourselves. And so question asking does feel important. And I think I like to, in poems, really think about, is it a genuine question? And so that was something that, um, going back through the book, it was interesting to look back through and try to put pressure on that.
In the foreword, you write that you wrote in part for your younger selves. How do you think your younger selves would respond to the book?
Such a sweet question. Yeah, and I'll make a note that that forward is only for recipients of like the advanced review copy, so it doesn't actually exist in the final book. And I hope that some of the sentiment of the forward just comes through in the book itself. But for younger selves and how they would respond to this book, I mean, I think like many writers talk about writing that book that you wanted to read to some degree. And like I do think there's absolutely younger versions of me that are just like grateful for the audacity, and to see certain questions on the page that, coming from growing up in a really religious, um, like Polish Catholic immigrant household, and just as an immigrant daughter, sort of these ideas of like privacy and what I was allowed to ask about. Speaking of question asking, like it wasn't my propensity toward question asking wasn't exactly encouraged or like something my parents loved about me. They're sort of like, that's just how it is, you know? And so to write can feel like a betrayal in some ways. And I think my younger self would be really different younger selves I can imagine being like, oh hell yeah. That I like finally had the like it took me a long time. I'm 35 and like in my 20s I really self-censored a lot. Like I really could not write because I was just there were so many other people in the room with me when I was writing at any given time, and that's still a challenge. And so I think there are younger selves that are like really grateful that I finally did this thing. And that I think in general, whenever I read and see people like grappling with some messy ideas, like I feel so grateful in my current self right now and get so much out of that of so many writers. So yeah, that's such a sweet question to ask.
One of my favorite lines early in the book was proud and devastated to be called American. I think that was in reference to like speaking English.
Mm.
And I wondered if you could speak a bit, because that feels like a common feeling felt by immigrants in 2025, but so different from the past ideals of America. Can you speak
Mm.
a bit about that feeling and maybe how it's changed throughout your life?
I'm pulling up that poem because I'm trying to think of what came right before, which was that I'll add some context that it was also like in that interaction where I mentioned that I say in another aunt's kitchen over rosehip tea, she said I wasn't as spoiled as they'd expected for an Americanca. I was proud and devastated to be called American. It was also a pride in not being associated with a kind of American spoiledness by my family in Poland. And so I think this was, I mean, that's a sentiment from a long time ago that like that poem came out of like my very first time going to Poland when I was 19. So a long time ago now. And so it's an old frustration in me, the lie of the American dream and the sort of sacrifices I've witnessed my parents having to make and everything that they endured as immigrants in this country and being undocumented for some time. And so there's always been in me this like frustration with Americanness, even as I also simultaneously have been so grateful for the life I've been gifted here because of my parents' sacrifices. And so my relationship to the idea of national belonging is like very charged, as it is for a lot of immigrants and children of immigrants, I think. And then there's the layer of whiteness and certain things that weren't assumed about me at a younger age. And that poem sort of unpacks and wrestles with the status a bit as someone who, you know, now my parents do have citizenship, but I grew up without that being the case. And so I think that even before this era right now, I've just always struggled with the mythology of Americanness and the ways that I watched it fail my own family, even with the privileges of whiteness. And so I'm always wrestling with the idea of Americanness. And then now, all the more so in our current political moment, it feels very obvious to more people that there is really, really something very dark about this illusion and just like the comforts and um, that we are afforded by Americanness that I'm a part of, benefit from these ideas of safety that get weaponized. I'm really suspicious of those in our current moment geopolitically across the globe. Like Americanness is something that really needs to be reckoned with, but it's a scary time to be very clear about that reckoning. We're in an era of increased surveillance, and I hope that more of us, though, can have courage in this time to really ask what that means to be an American. And so feels like a big question. And like you say, a lot of us share probably that sentiment of devastation, but it's complicated by the comforts that we're afforded too.
Absolutely. And this feels like a slightly mean question to ask after all that, but it's a question that I've been asking everyone this month, and I think I'm asking it because I'm struggling to find the answer myself. What can poetry offer us in 2025?
No, it's a good, clear-headed question that is not even, it's not mean. I mean, it's because I know there's that real understanding I think that we probably share and a lot of I'm guessing like viewers, listeners share of like it's limited. Like poetry has limitations and maybe there's a lot of people frustrated with poetry or with art and how it gets weaponized and how it writers or artists, might there might be people we admire whose work we admire who we feel like are failing us in this moment with language or an inability to speak. So, all of that is real. And I, do really believe that there's collective work we have to do together that is off the page, absolutely. And poetry is also about, even as a reader of poetry, it's about like an orientation toward the world that I think, at the risk of sounding like naive and idealistic, is we could benefit from in a time of like extreme fast pace, not a lot of critical thinking or an all-out war on critical thinking, um, on slowing down, where everything, there's just this, speaking of like American addiction to comfort, just like just wanting everything quick and to not have to think about it, and just the obsession right now with generative AI and all these things at the cost of our very planet and our very futures. It just feels like poetry is so absurd. Like you can obsess over a single word for your whole life. Like this book is born out of an obsession with certain words and ideas. And I think for us to slow down enough to unpack an idea, like the question of nation, like the question of safety, like the question of belonging, desire, to really like get curious about our own interior world and then how we read the world around us. Like those are skills that are being actively like defunded in schools. Like there's this level of which like reading poetry and acknowledging that there's also not one answer. Like a lot of people get frustrated with turning to a poem and being like, how do I solve it? That skill of like learning to be curious about your own thoughts, is really, I think, valuable in our current moment. Critical thinking, deep attention to the world, curiosity about what's underneath a given um, word, image. Yeah, that idea of like reading the world. How are we really like looking more closely at a given moment? I mean, it's to me like poetry is so relational actually. And I think an antidote to the fuckery, excuse my French, you can bleep that out, of the current moment is relational, is being in relationship with one another and figuring out how to do that, how to show up for one another. And so at its best, like poetry is working on so many different levels that I think can be of service in this moment. But again, it's not enough for it to just stay on the page, I think.
I think that's a great answer for sure. Let's talk about craft in the book. One of my favorite lines was, "Rage seems ordinary, easy enough, but it takes something from you to travel there." Can you speak a bit about what it means to travel to something like rage, an abstract feeling?
Yeah, it is a little related to some of what I was just sort of reaching toward, because how do we access a feeling and not just stay stuck there? Rage is this moment that you ask about. There's so much rage I think a lot of people are feeling, but are we feeling it? Like there's a lot of ways in which rage is a feeling that's really hard to give ourselves permission to access. And I mean, I think I'm not a therapist. I think people who study psychology have a lot to say about this sort of thing, but I'm really curious about like is it abstract? Like, isn't it something we can actually locate in the body? What happens when we try to do that? What is the like place that it can take us? Um, and especially in terms of thinking about like any kind of collective organizing, like rage is a part of it, and then there's connected to rage is like a love of what we want to protect, right? And so I think abstraction, I'm so drawn to, my mind often like works in abstraction, but because I uncover in the abstraction actually these really tangible things or felt things, like a seeming abstraction can actually be connected to like a sensation in the body. And maybe that comes from just like my love of and some training in dance and thinking in that way, where like any feeling or any idea, I actually think sometimes does connect for us to something in the body. And so I'm fascinated by that sort of paradox of abstractions. And I think in throughout the book, there's ideas like that being engaged with that I'm also attempting to connect to an actual experience that's in the world.
Yeah, you do often write about abstract things like time tracking, I mentioned in the questions, but I wondered if you could speak a bit about just like from a logistics sense, what it's like to write about abstractions, just like process wise.
That's such a good question. I always at the like this always makes me think that I want to do going forward like a better job of tracking like what my processes even look like, because I don't know if you can relate to this, but sometimes in the making of poems it's like I go to this other space that then later I'm like, what just happened or what was my process? And I think it's just some of it's like how my brain works. And I mean, when it comes to different abstractions and ideas in the book like that, some of them are things that I just get to think through and talk about with like people I love. And that's part of it. Like conversation is such a part of my process in a way. Like it's not so obvious like that. It's not like, oh, I have a conversation, then I sit down to write. It's more like conversations just are part of my thinking process, and the thinking process is so connected to the writing. And so an example of that is like specific to like abstract ideas that I was just thinking about the other day was that my very first time going to AWP was in Portland, like 2019. I had never been. I really knew so little about publishing world. I had like just published like one poem. I'd published like one other poem before. And there was this writer, Corinne Manning, who later became my friend, who was posted up outside of the conference talking with people, including people who weren't going in, like maybe hadn't paid for the conference or whatever, but they were just posted up talking to people about the difference between desire and longing, just like outside the convention center. And I remember we got into this like deep chat and we'd never met before that. And I loved that moment. I love thinking back on that moment for so many reasons, including like conversations and spaces that can happen on the fringes of institutions, and like how a single word or an abstract, seemingly abstract idea can be so rich. In conversation with others. It's part of why I love teaching. It's like this secret hack for me about like if I'm obsessed with some idea or some abstraction, like devotion, I often teach a workshop on like devotion and poetry, not because I'm an expert on devotion and poetry, but because I'm like learning from and soliciting ideas with students and with other writers, and because I'm constantly unlearning the thing. And I think abstractions are really rich terrain for me because of that, because it's just like infinite. It begs us immediately to ask, like any abstraction, you kind of need to also ask yourself, like, how did I get to this thinking? So it's so subterranean in that way. And so then for me, the place where it gets grounded in is my love of like image and sensory detail and like all of that. So I think like my process, I guess, is to say like conversation informs it, and so does my love of like figurative language, which at once allows me to stay in a realm of ideas and imagination, but to actually root it to something grounded as well.
How does travel inform your writing?
Mhm. I feel lucky to have people I love all over. And part of that's also like, growing up with family elsewhere was necessarily created a relationship to travel that was actually one that was a lot about longing because I didn't get to go to Poland for my first time till I was 19. So there was this like always this present longing to go to this place that my parents are and were from and so much family still lives. And so that the travel is like suffused with longing for me and complexity of also just as a person who's thinking about Americanness in the world, like I also it feels charged to go elsewhere and so like rich to go elsewhere. And then even within this country, like I'm so captivated by predictably by landscapes, by other ecologies, by different ways of being and how place impacts like the different lives people live. And so that's just been a fascination for me since I was a kid, maybe a product of just like wanting to live so many different lives. I feel like a lot of writers and artists can relate to that sort of art as a way to explore that longing and travel. Um, just being in a different place can do so much for me in terms of shaking up my own thinking to some degree. And it's really like land, like different places and their topography and like thinking on the scale of geological time is really fascinating to me. And so it's just any place, any shift in place, even trying to approach a place I live with the mind of like thinking backward or forward about like how a place has changed over time is really rich terrain for me as a writer. And so I think, yeah, and it's a great gift to be able to visit beloveds who live all over, even that though that's also like a painful thing to not have the people you adore close, but it can be so special to go and visit someone and see how they're living their life in a different place. That's like endlessly generative to me.
On a similar note, I really love the explicit references to erudite language terms throughout the close examination of language. One quote in particular, I'm obsessed with gerunds, their ongoingness. I try to use them less after a mentor tells me ings are corrosive. How do you think speaking other languages has informed your poetry?
It's so crucial to my poetry because I grew up speaking Polish and I was made to go to Polish school on Saturdays and church and Polish and Sunday school on Sundays. And as a kid, I hated having 7 days a week of school. And now I'm like, oh, wow, that was such a special thing for my parents to be low-key militant about because I couldn't go. It connected me to the language. We spoke it at home. And then in Polish school, in terms of poetry, I was immediately from a young age reading and even asked to memorize poems in Polish. And that was like my introduction to my love of poetry was in Polish. And that's so I feel so lucky for that to be like so captivated by that legacy of Polish poetry. And then immediately also that sensibility, that's that knowledge of what cannot be translated, to have that as a kid and not really have the language for it, but to know that feeling has definitely informed me as a writer. And I got to study Spanish from a young age and had a time in college where I got to study abroad in Chile, which also has such a rich history of poetry. And I was getting to study in Spanish some poetry and literally doing that reading in other languages is like, oh, I wish I had more time for it in my life in general because it's so widening of the possibilities of what language is and can be. And it's something I need to, it's making me realize talking about this. I'm like, I need to return to like my language study because reading in other languages, speaking in other languages, it brings up like other sides of us too, I think. And I think I would not at all be the same poet if I hadn't grown up speaking Polish and of course, and being connected to Polish poetry. It's been so influential in ways I can't even quite name yet.
Sort of related, but not really. There's lots of mention of music and instruments and sound throughout, which makes sense considering your performance background. How do you think music and performance have impacted your poetry?
Yeah, I grew up I played piano at a young age and I um yeah, thinking back, I'm so grateful that my parents, even with like the challenges they were experiencing and not having had the privilege of higher education themselves, and they really like understood that arts education to be valuable. And I got to study piano, and that itself, as well as just my love of music. My parents both love music, and I like had grew up when I was really little with a lot of like Beatles and Pink Floyd and various blues and all kinds of music in the home. And my dad actually would a long time ago would translate as a way to work on his English proficiency. I learned later in my life that he was like translating Beatles lyrics back when he was still in Poland, like into Polish and trying to from English and using it to try to get it's such a sweet thing to know about him, like that he was trying to find these ways through music and language to connect to this dream of coming to the US. And so it's part of my like DNA music, because of my parents' love for it and the ways my dad tried to self-teach. He self-taught himself some instruments. And so my love of music has just been since childhood. And then I love to sing, and I feel like all those things influence my poetry so much, and poetry is so musical. It's one of the things I love about poetry is that it connects to all the art forms. It is so sonic and visual and kinesthetic at once. And so being attentive to that is thanks to music and performance. I used to do more like dance-based performance. And I think all of the art forms enrich poetry. Like the more you play around with any art form, I think it can stretch the possibilities of the poem.
You mentioned the role of daughter in such interesting ways throughout, both searingly recognizable but also fresh and original. How do you think that role informs your writing?
Mm, I don't know if you can relate to this, but I feel like it overly informs my writing sometimes. I think daughterhood and the like tyranny of that role, not to be dramatic, but it can be part of this book is grappling with like wanting to shed that role sometimes, even as I'm so um even as like there's a line in the book that's like um something around like a daughter can never be grateful enough, or like some days I'm thankless. And I feel like I have this side of me that just is at once so grateful for, of course, for all my parents' sacrifices, and also has felt the pressure of them since childhood so acutely. And I think daughterhood is, of course, connected to patriarchy in our world and connected to certain prescribed behavior that I have a lot of questions about. And so, in some ways, daughterhood was, and my understanding of it was a barrier to writing for a long time, in order to perform a kind of good daughterhood. And it's been really beautiful to be in dialogue with, you know, any any daughter, even who hasn't like experienced. I love talking to, people who women in my life who are conditioned, like grew up conditioned as women, any child of immigrants, I always have such rich conversations with. I do think there's something particular. Like, I've talked to, American daughters who don't have immigrant backgrounds, and of course we have so much overlap, but there's something particular, I think, for those of us who are daughters whose parents took that immense sacrifice of coming here, where there's an acute pressure on us and in different ways, different cultural expectations. But it's been really healing for me and interesting to talk with other daughters who are also trying to find that balance of also honoring from where we came and like the complexity of our inheritance. And I mean that in sort of like emotional inheritance, maybe religious and cultural. And so daughterhood is another one of those things that I'll probably be grappling with ongoingly, especially as someone who is also wrestling with questions of sexuality and expectation around what is allowed for me to desire. And all of that feels really wrapped up in questions of the familial as well.
You bring up water a lot in like rivers, but just like water in general. Can you talk a bit about water's impact on your work?
Mhm. I grew up by Lake Michigan and would go there as a space of like I would ride my bike, I remember, to this one part where there was like a weeping willow tree and I could like see the lake and I could cry or I could, be moody or whatever it was in my teenage time. That was such a space of solace for me. I love that inland sea and how it just like looks so vast. And so even though it was a freshwater lake, I also felt like even though I didn't see the ocean for quite some time, I also felt like it had this oceanic quality because the Great Lakes are so huge. And so I was always fascinated by that. And then I became like rivers had this mythical quality for me because I didn't come to have like a real personal connection to rivers until I lived in Colorado. But before then, I like knew about this sort of creek slash river that my mom grew up by. Like I would hear about it. And it sort of felt like the stories, little stories I would hear about that took on this like almost mythological quality for me in part because I couldn't go to Poland for so long. And so then once I started having creeks and rivers that I would regularly visit, it felt like so charged for me. And water just feels connected to every question I have about the world. Like I feel like water just because rivers can be a source of transport, because I mean many bodies of water can be of even like our material goods. It connects to so many questions about our daily lives. And then there's these more spiritual connections and to questions of being and time and permanence. Just watching a river and all the things that people have said about never being in the same river twice. And this idea of ever changingness and movement in water is so interesting to me and so connected to the poetic image. Like at its best, the poetic image is working on so many levels and is revealing to us of both the sensory, tactile world and also the subterranean parts of us, the imaginative parts of us. And water is like that. There's actually something actual in there that we can touch and we can feel in our bodies. And then there's something so mystical about it. And obviously, certain bodies of water go so deep, and we don't even know. There's so much we don't know about the ocean's depths. And all of that just feels like such rich terrain for poetry and for grappling with any question in one's life. And then I quite literally go to bodies of water when I'm like troubled or have questions or feel like really sad. And so I think it's just in this book, it figures so much, but I think it will probably be part of just so important to me forever. And then thinking about the finite resource that fresh water is and the struggles we face right now and the problems of convenience I mentioned earlier that threaten to literally drain our water supply. Like it's so on my mind all the time of how do we honor and really like have a reverence for water.
On a somewhat related note, a line I really loved was, if belonging is form, its constraints erode the land. Can you talk a bit about how forms and constraints impact your writing, both on craft and thematic levels?
Mm. Yeah, maybe it's that, what do I call it? Like a rebellious side or like that questioning side of me that's like, form and constraint and just want to like break free of any of that. And yet also in poetry, form can be so freeing within when you have various constraints. It's such like a trite idea about creativity at this point, but there's a truth to it that there's something fascinating about constraints on like a piece of writing or art making that can allow us to go somewhere and get out of our own way when we're just facing a blank page. And it can be such a revision tool. Like if you're stuck with a piece of work, what happens when you constrain yourself to the ages old form of the sonnet and all the baggage and ideas that come with that legacy and that form and the literal constraints of syllables and certain rules, what happens when you put that on some material you're working with? Maybe it rubs up again. Maybe there's friction that's really like frustrating but generative in some way. Even if it doesn't work, it can like the ways it doesn't work is interesting as an artist, right? And so like what forms that can't contain our ideas is really interesting too. And so I think that that all relates to questions I have about like body in relationship to land and like body as form that we're in. And so I think, of course, then too, there's when we look at the earth from a higher vantage and we think about borders that are man-made and are not, and thinking about like constraint and form and belonging as like this topographic, like geographic idea. Like I think that the question of form is fascinating, mapped onto a lot of different things. And when talking about poetry, I find it really not necessarily, I'm not a formalist, but I do love learning from the different inherited forms and then playing with like invention of form. And I find it really fruitful for grappling with ideas that maybe are just way too abstract or lofty for me, to ground them in something that actually has been worked over by many other writers that came before. There's something beautiful about entering that kind of a conversation and seeing how forms evolve and how different writers push a particular poetic form is really beautiful sometimes.
Do you have a favorite poem in the book?
Someone else was just asking me the other day, and I think it depends. I was thinking recently about one poem in particular that's coming out soon that is the Sonnet Crown, Saint Hyacinth Basilica. I do think is one that's of great meaning to me, in part because, speaking back to like the daughterhood stuff mentioned before, it was something that I was scared to write. I mean, a number of these poems, I'm looking at my table of contents now, I was scared to write. So there's that like gratitude for having finally written the thing. And I think in a similar way, like I Found a Lover and We Left the City was a similar kind of poem for me, where like there was something that had been scared to write for so long, and then something happened where I suddenly accessed this writing experience that was like being possessed. Like with both those poems in different ways, I can remember being just like so compelled and in the process of writing it, and I can remember where I was. And that's not always something that happens for me with poems, and sometimes my drafting process is over years and in little fragments. But with both those poems, I had these like sessions where I could just like really dig into it. And so I think part of them being some of my favorites are also the memory of writing them.
What do you most hope people take away from reading this book?
Mm, I really, I'm really curious to honestly hear about any and all reactions that people have. I think that's part of it, is like the permission to go to some place uncharted in yourself, or like, if I'm so curious what desires and longings that people might have been keeping from themselves, if that feels emotionally safe to go there. Like I want there to be a sense of like permission to be curious about one's own interiority, if this gives that kind of permission to think about one's dreaming, what the word dreaming means to you, like for readers to just, yeah, for it to open up something that feels deep and maybe untouched, which is kind of a big ask of a reader and kind of like intense. But I'm also just so curious about how the book lands for different readers at all.
For what it's worth, I did genuinely think it was beautiful. So
Thank you. That's so sweet.
Can you give our viewers a writing prompt based on We Contain Landscapes?
Oh my gosh. I wish I'd prepared for this question, but I do have thoughts. I'm just looking at the book to think if there's one that I'll ground in. Well, a sort of easy one is to easy um, is to write a letter, a poem as a letter, but I'll say instead of to a living person, some of this book is lit. And if that catches your eye, go with that. Go write to someone you love who's living. But I do wonder about writing. I don't have one of these in the book, but in a way, some of the poems are this. I had an obsession with the figure of my great grandmother, for example, who I never met on my mom's side and never saw a photo of. And in some ways, some of the poems here reach toward her. And so maybe my prompt is like, what if you could write a letter, a poem in letter form to someone who you never met in your lineage? And if it could also be chosen family, if not bloodline.
That's awesome. I'm gonna try that.
Yeah, let me know.
Last question, because we don't have much time left, but I'm curious to know what your best strategies are for revision.
Yeah, I think something I love to do, speaking of form, if I'm feeling like, oh my gosh, on the idea level or the figurative link, thinking on this, putting pressure on images or ideas is too much. Like maybe I just need to give that a rest for a bit. Then thinking through form, just taking it all and putting it in a prose block if it's lineated and putting pressure on the poem in a new shape, or being like, oh, even something as simple as like, oh, the relational dynamic of couplets. If I pull this poem into couplets, not because it's going to stay there. I think sometimes too many poems are in couplets, right? But if I put the like relational pressure on these lines in this poem, what happens to the material? If I put it into tercets, which on one hand, 3 is such a stable shape, on the other, there's something charged and there's this extra third thing that's there, this pressure. It has religious undertones, like thinking about the number of lines in a stanza and getting really intentional about what that mood even is, and then putting pressure on one's work in different shapes, I think can open up like new cuts, and which I believe cutting and sculpting away can be so helpful. It can also reveal to us where we might write into more. So sometimes for me, it's literally changing the shape on the page will open up new ways. It's like this hack into revising in a deeper way. Whereas if I start with more like, oh, I'm putting pressure on the ideas or images, then maybe I get in my own way more.
Okay, actual last question, because I really love this line and really want to hear your thoughts on it. It was inside the letter for Joyce in particular. I am guilty of writing to be saved. Can you talk a bit about that line in that poem?
I love how so many of your questions are just getting to the heart of things. It's so good. Yeah, that's a vulnerable line. I think I turn to writing for so many reasons, some of them still unknown to me. And I turn to writing sometimes in times of despair. And then I find that, sort of like I said at the top of the interview, the work on the page isn't enough and is not gonna save me alone. But I think that it's not my own writing alone that like saves me, but that entering into these age-old conversations, looking back at this history of books that allows us to speak back to the dead and speak with the living and the future, something about that feels like it fortifies me for the struggles that we are in. And at the same time, this impossibility of language ever being able to save us is sort of like heartbreakingly beautiful too. So I think that's some of what that line is getting at.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me on your show. It's such a pleasure. There's so many questions I want to ask you.
Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your Sunday, and I hope we run into each other again.
Yes, I hope so too. Hopefully in March. This is so great. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Have a good rest of your day.